Informative and engaging. Rick Munn on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Welcome back to Locked and Loaded show on TNT Radio. I'm your host, Rick Munn, and we've got a great show lined up today. I'm joined firstly by my friend from Northern Ireland, a guy called Jonathan Weissman. Then later on in the show, we will have, all being well, the Australian MP, Greg Christensen, who has been ruffling some feathers this week, specifically the feathers of a certain Mr. Scott Morrison, who will be coming on hopefully in a few hours' time to talk about the events of the day. Also, finally in the show today, we have a human rights lawyer / advocate from Northern Ireland, a guy called Stevie Atherton, who I will be very happy to speak with. But first of all, without taking up any more time, I just want to welcome my first guest, Jonathan Weissman. Jonathan, welcome to TNT Radio.
Thank you very much, Rick, and it's great to be here today. Absolutely.
No, thank you for taking the time. I've asked if it's possible that we block off 2 slots today because we have a lot to cover, and you have done a lot of work and research in and around the subject of vaccine ingredients, vaccine injuries. You're a big advocate of, awareness, raising awareness of what's going on in that field. You're also a cybersecurity expert, professional, teacher. But there's a lot we can cover. You've been organizing seminars, specialist seminars as well, to raise awareness and increase knowledge of various topics that are relevant to all of us that's happening in the world right now. But can you just expand a little bit? I've given like an overview of what you're about. Can you just tell us a little bit about your background? You're an Englishman. You've ended up in Northern Ireland, and usually there's one main reason for that. You'll either meet someone or you'll be moving over here for a job. So tell us a little bit about your background, Jonathan, and what you're about.
Sure. Yes, I get that a lot. A lot of people assume I came over for a relationship, which isn't the case. So it was a job I came for. I knew it was it had to be one of the two. No one comes from England to Northern Ireland unless there's either a person or a job involved. So it's the less exciting one, but it's cybersecurity is I actually started off when I came to Northern Ireland in software development with a low code platform. And then over the time, I transitioned into a cybersecurity role. And even that transition was quite interesting because the area I was interested in was what I call third-party risk management, which is essentially understanding the level of risk that an enterprise or a company is exposed to through a relationship with a third party, a software provider. It was actually this paradigm that struck my interest when it came to the COVID-19 experimental products, because I thought, wait a second, I need to independently verify the risks of this novel technology. So that's actually where it came from. Yeah.
Okay. So you basically applied what you would have been doing in cybersecurity to the sort of methodology of risk assessment that you would have done on a cybersecurity basis. You looked at this product, for want of a better expression, that was unleashed upon the world, which is the so-called COVID vaccines, whether they be the AstraZeneca vaccines or the mRNA gene therapy type ones through Pfizer and Moderna. You decided to perform a risk assessment in those because, let's face it, we were just told that these have been developed in breakneck speed. They were being rolled out, from the so-called pandemic was first introduced to us in March 2020. By December, I believe, 2020, the first of the vaccines was actually injected into people's arms. So you're looking at a 9-month turnaround from, the coronavirus was we were made aware of it, to a product being available to, at the time, and when it was punted to us, it was, the be all and end all. It's like, this is our way to get free. We inject the vulnerable, 15 million jabs to freedom, and then we're all good to go. So did that cause you concern? Was that what set the alarm bells ringing for you that, we need to look at this in more depth? At what point did you realize that?
Sure. Well, it would be on the marketing side would have been one part. Essentially, the government, the public health bodies like the NHS, and even our medical regulator, the literature coming out, the TV adverts or the news bulletins, the statements from our politicians, the NHS videos on YouTube, really across the board, it's essentially a misrepresentation of what it is. So they would say things like, this is just like any vaccine, for example. Things like it's faced all the same safety studies that anything else has faced, yet it's been condensed into 6 months. That's simply impossible.
Yeah.
Those kind of facts were really what provoked me to essentially independently go across not just the sort of short-term acute safety risks, but actually across the whole literature. So trying to work out what could potentially be the long-term prognosis for taking some of these experimental products, and also sort of with a fine-tooth comb, going through the clinical trials and trying to understand whether these manufacturers are actually credible or not. So I think it's really about being quite intensive in terms of independently verifying the risk.
And why did it have to fall to someone like you to have to do this? I mean, surely when something like this comes to market, guys like yourself, experienced and knowledgeable and educated and able as you are, you shouldn't be having to do this. The government should have done this in advance, which obviously they claim. For anyone that's not aware, these products were granted what was called emergency use exemptions. Okay, so they were also with social media, especially Twitter or Facebook or whatnot. If anyone suggested that these vaccines were experimental products, they were censored heavily or banned. Okay, but in reality, these products are actually still in clinical trial until at least January, February of 2023. So we have another 12 months should this program continue to be rolled out with children and indefinite booster shots, it would seem at this point. These drugs are still in clinical trial until 12 months from now. So for them to sit and say that there is safety data, we can show that this is safe, they can't, because we're effectively the population that has received these injections are basically they're the experimental group. Would that be a fair statement?
Absolutely. And a lot of people probably don't know just how many relatively risky things have been done simply to get the technology to work, but we lack the safety studies on them. So when you go down to the level of, as you say, what's inside of these experimental products, and you take, for example, the mRNA ones on the one hand, we have 2 novel lipids inside of them. This is both Pfizer and for Moderna. We have, firstly, a cationic lipid, ionizable, which essentially creates a positive charge in the cell, because you have to overcome this problem of delivering fragile RNA or mRNA molecules into human cells and get them to trust them and to not sweep them away like cellular waste. But the problem is you need that positive charge in the cell. But we've never had these before in any kind of a vaccine. In fact, when you go into the history in the last 10 or 12 years of cationic lipids, their major application is essentially for a cancer therapeutic, which makes some sense because you want to kill cells that are cancerous, essentially. That may make some sense if you're already very sick, if you've already got cancer, you've already got infected cells. But when you're a sort of a healthy person, you're a young person, and you may clear this virus with sort of no issues, to go and stick something in that is essentially for a cancer therapeutic is a very risky thing. And then the other lipid would be the PEG lipid, which, can cause anaphylaxis. And we know that because so many people actually already have antibodies against it, which is essentially the body recognizing it as pathogenic. And there are so many examples like this, which I think it's not that we can't use this technology. It's not that I'm saying, absolutely under no circumstances, but give people the information, let them know all the risks.
Exactly. It's like smoking, right? I'm not an advocate of smoking cigarettes, but if you want to go out and buy yourself a pack and smoke. That's your business. It's your body. You can put into it what you want. At least that's the way we are at the moment. But when you go into a newsagent or a supermarket, especially in Northern Ireland, I was explaining this to people a few days ago, but we keep our tobacco products now behind a screen, so you can't actually see them. And when you ask for cigarettes, they have to open up this cabinet. You have to point at what you want, because all the packaging is now pretty much blank or plain. And there's a big warning on it to say smoking kills, smoking causes cancer. And in some cases, there's a picture of like a cancerous lung that's been cut out of a dead smoker. You know, there's as much red flags being waved at you as a consumer, but still you're given the choice. And also the price is ridiculously high. You know, if you want, I don't know what a packet of cigarettes is over here, but it's around £12 or like 22 Australian dollars. There's as much to de-incentivize you from buying that product as there could be. And it's all factual. It does kill. It does potentially cause cancer, but still people have the right to go and buy it. And I've said this week as well, by the way, it's not even so much, number one, I'm not an anti-vaxxer because I've been vaccinated against so many things, especially for travel, you know, to sub-Saharan Africa. I've got a list, you know, of things that I've taken, and I'm not anti-vaccine. And if people want to go out and take a COVID vaccine, that's their business. It's none of my business. All I'm advocating for, like yourself or like you've just said, is that people have informed consent and people know exactly what they're getting, and people know the actual survival rates of COVID, which is around about 99.7%, and the average age of death is around about 82. With all that in mind, taking on board all that, if you then decide you want to go out and have been given the risks and the warnings and the fact that it's experimental and they're containing cancer-treating proteins, that's up to you. But the problem is, Jonathan, people aren't being told the facts. They're not being told the ingredients. They're not being told the full extent of the adverse reactions. And that's the crime that's being committed right now. It's not that these vaccines are here. It's the fact that people aren't being told what they are, that they don't really actually need them based on age group and morbidity and, you know, underlying conditions. And that's why we have ourselves in this position where people are blindly accepting a chemical treatment that they maybe don't like. Would that be a fair statement?
Absolutely. And I think as you mentioned, with the fact that they're still in ongoing clinical trials to study their safety and ongoing efficacy, and even on the efficacy, it's not the case that the disease endpoint they used in the clinical trials is essentially protection against infection. And they had these impressive figures. They marketed at us, 95% efficacy. This is a relative risk reduction. And what this means is, in terms of the number of cases, there were 95% fewer cases for sort of Pfizer and Moderna versus the control group. Well, there's a couple of problems with that. I like to explain that because the spike protein of the virus is mutating, it's highly mutable, it's a surface protein, and it's coming under all this evolutionary pressure, essentially, because you've got all these people who have an antibody response from vaccination, but it's outdated. It's against the original strain. So those kind of numbers, that kind of efficacy might have held up under the clinical trials. And even then, there are some questions. You go back to some of the whistleblowing allegations, for example, Brooke Jackson in the BMJ, I think that was in November last year. But when you look today, in terms of efficacy, you look at the data coming from the UK Health Security Agency. I looked at the data from Public Health Scotland recently. There's essentially equivalent rates of infection across both vaccinated and unvaccinated. And that makes sense because the current circulating variant, which is the Omicron, essentially has antibody neutralization evasion. So those antibodies will not stop cellular infection. And I think that's a very important point, as well as the safety risks. It's also, you go back to, people were told to take it because if everybody takes it, we will acquire what's called herd immunity. And essentially we'll cut the oxygen from the system and this thing can't spread. Now, many of us knew this is completely untrue because of this evolutionary pressure on the spike protein and because it's such a narrow antibody response. You cannot stop infections. And I think that's also very important to add to the mix.
Yeah, let's look at efficacy. Whenever this was efficacy just is a technical term for effectiveness, really. You know, how effective is it against doing what it's supposed to do? So when these products were brought to market in December 2020, there was a very big, there was a lot of fanfare and a lot of expectation from people that this would be the way out. And the way it was positioned to the public right across the board was, and I mean, there's now, compilation clips available on YouTube or well, maybe not YouTube because they're so heavily censored, but of doctors that did come on to television, or pharma heads or Fauci, people like that, to say, okay, the efficacy of this is all right. It's almost 100%. It'll stop you from dying. It'll stop you from getting infected. It'll stop you from spreading infection. It very quickly became apparent that it didn't stop infection from spreading. It didn't stop people from getting infected. It certainly didn't stop people from dying because, although that's another topic again, dying with COVID, dying of COVID. It basically didn't do anything that they had originally positioned it to be able to do. The only thing that they can say now as a selling point is, okay, it might, in inverted commas, it might stop you from getting seriously ill. But you can't quantify that either. And yesterday there was an Australian health chief came on and he actually said the efficacy with 2 doses of vaccine is 4%. So he actually said that on national TV in Australia. He said the efficacy is 4%. And he said if you get boosted, it goes up to a whopping 64%. Where they get these percentage figures from, I don't know. I don't trust them. But the fact that he was actually coming on TV in the middle of a booster campaign to say, if you've already had 2 doses, the efficacy is now dropped to 4% against Omicron. That's not really a good sell, in my opinion,
Sure. And what you see now essentially is increasingly tenuous reasons to morally coerce the population to take it. And what I mean is, when you go back, as we just mentioned, to Freedom Day and this idea that Boris Johnson had that if everybody just takes it, we can open up society. The idea there was essentially, if everybody takes it, then you will not have viral spread and you won't be killing granny. You won't kill your grandparent or you won't kill a stranger when you go to the shop. But since the idea of infection and transmission protection has essentially completely gone and everyone knows it, the next tenuous argument they can make is essentially, if you take this therapeutic, regardless of how healthy you are, regardless of how strong your innate immune system is, regardless of if you're the healthiest person that's ever lived, it will reduce the possibility of you having a severe case of COVID and you'll take up a bed or an ICU bed, which someone else whose vaccine doesn't work would need. And that's essentially the tenuous argument that they make. And I think it's really incredible for me as a Christian to look at the kind of moral arguments that are essentially made and the kind of pressure people are put under. What I saw, going back to the summer when I first got involved in all this work, was actually, I feel that they're using our humanity against us. These are actually things we want to be good citizens. We want to protect the vulnerable. We want to protect our family members. However, there's a lack of truth and honesty in the messages we're receiving. And I think that's quite cruel, really.
Yeah. And the lack of truth and integrity, I mean, like, if you have a word association game and you say politician, usually the first word that'll come to mind is corrupt. Okay, that's a fact. Now, I've said this, I've quantified this as well, because we have a politician coming on next. He's a good guy from the Australian government. Obviously, it's a broad brush application of the term. Not every single person. It's like some people, there's a movement, ACAB, all cops are bad. They're not all bad. I have a few friends who are in the police force. They're my friends. They're decent people. They try and do a good job. But there's rotten apples in there. Okay, it just so happens that in the political realm, there's more rotten apples per good apples. Probably the ratio skewed heavily towards the rotten apples. So I'm generalizing here, but the lack of integrity, dare I say it, you would almost expect that from politicians. But when it comes to doctors or teachers or clergy, or call them what you like, church people, church leaders, heads of denominations and religious movements, you would expect a little bit more integrity from those people. And certainly when it comes to, the church, you would expect truth, but it seems to have been lacking in every department. So it wasn't just the politicians were leading people down the wrong path. It would seem now that that has been supported and bolstered by, the medical profession, the teaching profession, the way children are being treated in schools, albeit they're following orders, which is the old get out of jail free card for people that have done bad things, and the church. So, the integrity seems to be lacking right across the board, and that's not a good position to be in as a society.
Well, this is right. And this is one of the things I tried to emphasize with my work. It's actually there in the title of the risk assessment I wrote on my website, which is I'm independent. And what that means is I'm not financially incentivized by any of the work I do. And I've tried to make this point a number of times that somebody like me really only stands to lose, whether that's loss of reputation or loss of money, loss of employment opportunities. That's essentially where all the doctors who are speaking out, whether it's people like Dr. McCulloch or Dr. Malone, whether they're medical doctors or whether they're sort of research scientists, and the same for all those in the UK and Northern Ireland, all of them essentially stand to lose and are ridiculed and are made to feel, like they're doing something wrong. Whereas a lot of the people who maybe have a different position within the church or within the sort of mainstream medical world actually are receiving money. So in terms of the doctors, they're paid per jab, for example, and a little extra for jabbing the children. And then I have heard rumors that even some of the denominations were paid essentially to lock down their churches and to close them in the first place. Mm-hmm. And I think that's another very important point is people being financially incentivized to take their position.
We're going to take an ad break pretty much now, but I want to pause there because that's something I want to come back. The old 30 pieces of silver business that's going on right across the board, these financial incentives that have been lavished upon various professions and institutions to get us into this position. I want to pick up on that after the break. You're listening to Rick Munn. My guest is Jonathan Weissman. This is TNT Radio. Back after the break.
Unlike other health concerns, mental illness is not always easy to see. Depression won't show up on an eye chart, and you won't find PTSD by looking at a thermometer. Sorting out a mental health concern takes professional diagnosis and treatment. Anxiety won't just go away under a bandage. If you or a loved one has a mental health concern, call 1-800-662-HELP for free and confidential information and treatment referral. Learn more at samhsa.gov/support.
A few years ago, Steve Faircow's lungs were failing.
I don't think I had more than a couple weeks to live.
That's when Steve received a lung transplant made possible by an organ donor. Now Steve can do things he never imagined, like climbing 94 floors to the top of a skyscraper.
I never knew that breathing could feel this good. It's an incredible gift.
What could you make possible as an organ, eye, and tissue donor? Leave behind the gift of life. Go to organdonor.gov, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Health Resources and Services Administration.
What is a number story?
My number story started with fear and a lack of support, and it has led me to be there for others.
A number story begins in our childhood with ACEs, adverse childhood experiences.
My number story begins with the separation from my father and the emotional abandonment from my mother, and leads to me being a role model to not only myself, but those around me by becoming the person that wasn't there for me.
ACEs are so common, 2/3 of us have one.
My number story begins with drug abuse and homelessness and leads to realizing that I can live life by my own standards.
A study found the more ACEs, the more likely we may experience a host of serious health effects, physical and mental, but that doesn't need to be the case. Your ACE number is simply an entry point to your own story. Where it leads is up to you.
My number story begins with years of emotional abuse and leads to peace, clarity, and security in my self-worth.
Take control of where your number story leads at numberstory.org.
This is today's News Talk Radio, TNTRadio.live.
Welcome back to the show. I'm joined this morning by Jonathan Weissman, a fellow resident of Northern Ireland like myself, which is particularly nice because you're the first Northern Irishman or Northern Irish resident I've had on the show. So welcome, Jonathan. We're talking about incentives this morning. That's the topic of conversation right now. The world locked down, as everyone is aware, over the last 22 months in various stages and to various degrees. And, that involved doors shutting and the shutters being pulled down in businesses, therefore no income. People being told to go and sit in the house because they couldn't come into workplaces. How were they supposed to earn a living? Churches, establishments were told to shut. That meant parishioners or congregations couldn't come in. And, at the end of the day, I'm sorry to say, but, churches are a business too, to an extent. They've got themselves into the position whereby, they have overheads, they have big buildings and shrinking congregations. Okay. So in the wintertime, especially in Northern Ireland, it can be quite cold. You've got heating going on for these massive churches and, big high roofs and stone walls and so on and so forth. You've got a minister or a rector or a pastor, call him what you want, who has a job to do, and he's paid to do it, gets a car, maybe gets a house, has a curate, has an assistant, they have benefits. It costs money. Okay. It costs money. And when the doors close, especially over here, generally speaking, there's very old people who have been in congregations for a very long time. They're not really used to direct debits and bank accounts. So they would do what's called a free will offering in a lot of churches in Northern Ireland, where they would pass a plate literally around the congregation. They would throw some cash in, and that would go towards maintaining the overheads of the church. But when the doors are closed, those people aren't there, and there's no plate to be passed around. So, how have these churches survived, Jonathan? Am I joining the dots here? What picture am I getting?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I think for me, I like to take a kind of long view of the situation. So at the moment, as you said, we essentially have the church kind of in lockstep, at least the major denominations, with the government's position. So whether it's the masks, and you see the posters in the church, to wear the mask and it's compulsory, or even down to administering the experimental vaccines from the church, social distancing as well. Essentially, what I'm saying is across the board, you have total lockstep compliance with the government. And then even beyond that, the church is adding a little bit of weight to it. They're actually extolling the vaccines from the pulpit often, claiming that, everyone needs to take it in order to come into the church, and that should be the normative behavior. And I think really what this is the sort of the end point of a theology that essentially teaches that the government is there under all circumstances for your betterment, and God has appointed the government regardless of the behavior that they do. We as good citizens should consent to it and should even encourage it, because we want to be seen to be the most passionate citizens, the most loyal citizens, if you will. I think it's really a theological issue, as well as what you say about not wanting to rock the boat as well, in terms of keep everything together.
See, this is the problem, and I don't mean this disrespectfully if anyone's listening and they're, an attendee of a congregation or a denomination, but generally speaking, the people in the pews or the people in the congregation are looking to their minister, pastor, priest, call them what you like, okay, their leader, their church leader. They're looking to him for guidance, okay, guidance on, spiritual matters, guidance on moral issues. Maybe if they're having a problem in a marriage, they'll come to him and they'll say, listen, can you give us some advice, some sound biblical advice, whatever it happens to be. And the average person is reliant upon their church leader for that moral guidance or that spiritual guidance or prayer support or whatever. Most people, and I'm generalizing again, but most people, you take the Bible, everyone has one, but who actually reads the thing? It's usually brought out from a drawer in a box on a Sunday. People take them into church, but generally speaking, they might read it the odd time when they're sick or they're in need. They'll go scrambling for a word of encouragement. But by and large, the knowledge of God's word is generally low, I would say, right across the board. Generally speaking, I'm talking, and I'm no expert myself, but I try and do a little bit of reading here and there, and I'm reasonably well versed in the Word of God. And what I know and what I have been studying myself over the last 28 to 30 years since I became a Christian, it doesn't line up. What I'm seeing in churches and what I'm seeing right across the board does not line up with God's word, although we're being told now, and it's being twisted, and we're being gaslit by our own church leaders to say, well, actually, if Jesus was alive today, he would take the vaccine. What a load of nonsense. Who could say that? And to say that if we don't take it, we're somehow being immoral. Justin Welby, the so-called Archbishop of Canterbury, who, in case you don't know it, is also a man with World Economic Forum links, is pontificating that if we don't take this vaccine, that we're somehow we're not fulfilling our moral duty towards loving our neighbor. He doesn't understand the Word of God also says that Jesus said you cannot serve two masters. You cannot serve God and mammon, because if you do that, you'll love one and you'll cling to the other, or you'll hate one and love the other. And at the end of the day, he has his foot in the mammon camp, which is the World Economic Forum and what's going on with them. And then he has his foot in the Church of England. He's straddling the two fences. And by definition, he can't do that. He's in love with one of them. And by his words and by his actions, and from what I can see of him, the person that he loves is certainly not God Almighty.
Well, absolutely. And I think, again, theologically, there's a sort of critical issue here. And it's that the church does a good job of emphasizing personal holiness. If you're to ask most people, what is the church's position on morality as regards to, how you should treat your neighbor or how you should treat your body, things like that, people would be able to account for what most of the major church denominations believe in. However, what the church has critically failed to do in recent times, and it was the same thing really in Nazi Germany, is to think about public holiness. This idea that Christians are very much called to make public stands for the Lord and to give God glory, essentially by, as you say, putting the Lord above everything else. And I think when you look back at the Old Testament, it's really replete with examples of the faithful men and women of God essentially putting their faith in God above everything, their own life, and giving God the glory in that moment. You think about Esther when she went to see the king against the norms of the king's decrees. And you think about, for example, Daniel and the Hebrew boys, and I come back to this story a lot because they were asked to essentially bow down to a false god under Nebuchadnezzar. But what did they do? They said, well, we won't do that, even though Daniel was very, very prominent in the kingdom. So he was doing very well for himself, but he refused to do that. And essentially he risked his own life in order to make a stand against putting anything above his God. And I think that's very important.
Yeah, that's the key. I mean, we're not, listen, we are just flesh and blood. We're human beings. Whenever we're told to love our neighbor, it's not about going and getting a vaccine that doesn't work, okay, and that has no efficacy, and that does not stop me from actually infecting my neighbor, or my neighbor infecting me, or me dying and causing them to die. Loving your neighbor means, whether that be the person literally in the street or the house beside you, whether that be a friend, a family member, you stay in touch with them. You find out if they need anything. You find out if you ask, are you doing okay? Is there anything I can do to help you? Can I be there for you? Can I support you in any way? That's what's called loving your neighbor. You're treating other people how you would like to be treated yourself. And when it comes to what's been going on over the last 2 years, you use a little bit of common sense as well. If I've been feeling unwell, I'm not going to go and visit you and say, oh, I've got a really bad cough, and splutter all over you. No, I'm going to say, listen, I can't see you this week, man. I'm feeling a little bit unwell. And you, if you're showing love to me as my neighbor, say, well, listen, I know you can't leave the house. I know you're very ill. Can I go and get you some food? I'll leave it at the door. Give me a call if you're really, really bad. If you need me to take you down to the hospital, that's practical love. It's not running the vaccination center and rolling up your arm and getting jabbed, as they say, and coming out with a little badge to say, I've had my booster, and putting it on social media. That's not loving your neighbor. That's mental illness.
Sure. And I think the other aspect I'd point it to would be self-righteousness is what it's become. And what I mean by that is the whole COVID system, which is really what it is. It's a system now with essentially sacraments. So, you know, wearing the mask and using the hand sanitizer and taking the jab and then putting it on your Facebook or your social media. It's an entire system where you can do things to attain sort of social currency, if you will, and for people to think you're doing a really good job. You're doing absolutely everything you could do. You know, you take your 2 lateral flow tests a day and you wear 2 masks of the highest quality.
Yep.
But essentially, as you said, none of this can actually stop the infection and transmission. So it's not working. That's clear. But also for Christians who really should be focused primarily on the glory of God and his word, to go and introduce a bunch of stuff and to place so much emphasis on it that you're willing to exclude people who are not willing to be part of that system, lock, stock and barrel, I think is essentially putting a stumbling block there for people's faith. And I think from that perspective, it requires really close scrutiny. All of it does.
Yeah. I mean, like, it's, you know, there's a lot of things that are implemented, you know, they just don't make sense, period. And I'll give you an example. There's a local church that I would have been associated with at one point in the past, who I knew a lot of people that were in it because they were old and I grew up from a kid knowing them. A few of them died last year and the funerals were being held, and these were well-known people in the community and, you know, the cornerstones of the congregation. So in any other time, the church would have been packed to the rafters. There'd have been people sitting in the aisles, you know, give them a send-off, even though, you know, they're dead. They don't realize it, but it's for the family and the friends to go and pay their respects and then go and have a sandwich afterwards and a cup of tea and you catch up with your friends. That's the way we do things in Northern Ireland, okay? So anyway, this nonsense came along with the pandemic, and of course, the churches are in lockstep with the government. So they're mandating masks and they're saying, okay, if you're coming into the funeral, there can only be 30 members in the congregation, preferably family only. You must wear a mask. You must sit 6 feet apart in the pews. Some churches are actually taking the cushions off the pews because they believe, you know, the material, the fabric on the cushions can actually hold coronavirus and spread it to the flock, let alone the fact that they're sitting on wooden benches then. So not only are they still sitting on a surface, but it's a hard, uncomfortable surface. It's almost to make it as uncomfortable as possible. But anyway, these funerals, 30 people in the church, masks, absolutely must wear a mask. No singing. That's another one. You can't sing because if you sing, you're projecting the virus. Even though you're wearing a face mask, you're projecting the virus. So anyway, people actually went along with this. And the ironic thing was, I went to pay my respects also. My dad came down to pay his respects. We stood outside the church. Okay. There must have been 500, 600 people standing around the walls of the church, shoulder to shoulder, shaking hands. How you doing? Haven't seen you for a long time. No face mask. And then the doors of the church swung open, you know, slowly. And out came the minister in his robes with his double mask, his double black mask, and the coffin, and the mourner standing 6 feet apart, while 600 people who weren't allowed in the church were just standing there watching this, you know. And it was tragic. It happened 2 days in a row. And I just thought to myself, come on, man, into my head, take off the mask, let the people come in and pay their respects to their friends. They're doing it outside anyway. Why not just throw the doors open? Why not have a spine and a backbone? But no, because they're in lockstep. And it's hard to watch that, you know, it's hard to watch it, especially with people that you've known from you were a kid and in a place that you've known from you were a kid. And you're like, come on, well, just do the right thing. But they're not doing it.
Sure. And you see that a lot, this sort of lack of humanity, you could say, or the ways we normally express ourselves. Really, as I say, going back to this idea of it's a system and it's sort of, you know, be as gloomy faced as you can be, or in fact, don't even show your face with the mask. And the other thing I'd say is be as sort of weak and vulnerable. And that seems to be extolled, this idea of being afraid. And you see this, I think, quite often in this whole period we've been dealing with COVID-19 is, you know, if you want, you don't have to, you know, sort of leave your house. You don't have to go to public places. you don't have to do anything. Somebody else will come all the time and deliver to you, or we can do everything remotely through, Zoom or whatever it is when it comes to the workplace. And I think the other side of that would be how I thought is, well, we should just be brave and wherever possible, try to go through this. And that essentially is kind of what we normally do in these scenarios. We try not to take away our fundamental freedoms. We say, okay, maybe there is this idea of a threat, of an enemy, and the government use this idea of it's the virus. We're essentially at war. Okay, fair enough. But normally at a time of war, we have a sort of a brave stance, and we try to go through things without betraying, weakness and fear.
Yep.
But instead, what we have is the sort of glorification and marketing of fear. And I think this was deliberate ploy by the government. When you go back to the images of people on ventilators, and, the very intense idea that everyone's going to be susceptible to a severe case of COVID-19, regardless if you've already been infected or wherever your health status is. And I think, again, this has all come down from the government as well as from the church. And bringing the two together, we just have this very unhelpful sort of self-righteousness and induction of fear into a civilian population, which I think is pretty much unprecedented as far as I can see in history.
Yeah, this business of fear, you can expect the government to drive fear. Fear's been the driver behind this entire thing. Fear, propaganda, confusion, and propaganda have brought us to the position that we're in. You can expect that from a corrupted government. You do not expect that to come from the church. Fear is the opposite of faith. Okay, that's a fact. So fear is the opposite of faith. So the church, instead of countering the fear with faith, is embellishing and supporting and propping up that message of fear. Now, it's also important to know, on the faith spectrum or the belief spectrum, you have some people who are terrified within the church. Unfortunately, you have the other side of the spectrum is, some denominations, and I won't name them, but or sort of major known preachers, they began by saying, "Oh, we're safe. God will protect us. We won't get sick. Psalm 91. We're nothing that can come against us will kill us." That's nonsense as well, because at the end of the day, you don't tempt God. Okay, I know I can get sick at any time from coronavirus. I had it at Christmas. I felt pretty rough. I'm coming off the back of it now. Thank God. But I've always said, even when I'm doing stuff like this, or when I was doing Twitter videos from the beginning of all this, I said, listen, I know I could get this. I know I could die from it. I could be that guy. I know I'm not immune but I'm being sensible. I'm trying to use some common sense. I'm avoiding people that are sneezing and coughing and that have high temperatures. I'm doing the right thing, but I could get this and die. Some people are just running through life going, no, I have faith, I have God, I'm not going to get it. And the next thing, those are the guys that are dropping dead, because it's like the temptation in the wilderness. When Satan came to Jesus, he said, throw yourself off the temple, because it is written, he will give his angels charge over you. And he says, no, thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God. You have to be sensible in all this. So you've got one end of the spectrum of faith where people are being too sensible to the point that they're terrified, and then you have the other aspect that they're gung-ho. They're just running around going, no, I'm safe. I know a guy who's a good friend of mine, and he was convinced he was not getting sick, and then he got sick and he was confused. He said, Rick, what happened? Why? I said, listen, there's no guarantees with anything. God may be good and gracious and merciful that you don't get it, okay? And thus far, you've avoided it for 2 years, but you got it. And you're better now, He said, I just can't understand why I got sick. I said, because there's no guarantees, okay? We'll have to be realistic about this. We'll have to tread the middle ground in terms of we're not gung-ho one way and we're not terrified in the other way. We'll have to use some common sense. And sadly, that's lacking as well.
Well, absolutely. And kind of going back to when I first got involved in this kind of work, actually one of my fears wasn't really in terms of the work I'm doing or the conclusions I'd drawn or the quality of the analysis I'd done. It was essentially the idea that what happens if I was to contract this infection, get a severe case, and then people would say, "Oh, but you were doing all this stuff against the vaccine," and that was all I was afraid of. Actually, it wasn't actually the disease itself; it was basically being called out.
Sometimes when I was writing tweets or making these videos, I thought, "Oh man, this could really backfire on me if I get corona." But I never ever, and this is right through any podcast that I've done, any interviews that I've done, I've never denied the fact that someone could get this respiratory disease. I've never said that I can't get it and I might die of it. I could be a casualty. But when I put the statistics in the balance, okay, the average age of death at the UK at the time was 82 years and 3 months. The average age of death with old age was 81. So I was statistically more likely to live to 81, okay, as an old man, than to live to 82 years and 4 months and die with COVID. My chances of survival based on my age, my weight, and comorbidities is around about, 99.9%. So I could be the 0.1%. I get that, but I'm prepared to take that chance just to maintain a semblance of normality in my life and go about my business, which I have been doing for the last 2 years. And you know what? I'm still alive. And so is everyone else that I know that's taken the same approach. Thank God. Thank God.
Well, absolutely. And, to blunt the charge that I'm a sort of COVID denier, I say, well, no, I'm not denying it. Actually, I'm really passionate about the early intervention treatments. I'm really passionate about providing a sort of conventional antiviral challenge to the virus. Because if you go back and you think, right, we have a pandemic, say, we have lots of infection and transmission. And right now we're stuck essentially on social distancing, vaccines and masks. Actually, though, if you take a slightly broader view and you just go and think, well, actually, what else could we do? Well, we could use nasal sprays like they used in Bangladesh. We could use providine iodine, for example. We could use antivirals to try to reduce the amount of viral replication in the upper respiratory tract. You look at some of the hit pieces, let's just say, in the fraud that have been done against the likes of hydroxychloroquine, for example. And then beyond that, there's a competitive space right now, even for the inhaled steroids, if you do catch a case of severe COVID and you're hospitalized. So for me, it's very much not a case of denying it. Actually, I'm sort of very passionate about the full spectrum of public health right now. I just think the debate is way too narrow. And I think if the solution to this problem is something that absolutely everybody without exception has to take, even though many of them do not want to take it, maybe that's the wrong solution to the problem. Maybe there's something else going on, and maybe we should change our tactic pretty fast.
Yeah, you talk about tactics. If you actually go on to the NHS's very own website, what do I do if I'm exhibiting signs of COVID? Okay, so they're all for testing and the isolation and stay at home and don't see anyone. What they advise is, they advise people that if you have symptoms of COVID, you'll probably be all right. So just stay home, take your paracetamol, take your ibuprofen, keep your temperature down, drink plenty of fluid, rest. But if you deteriorate and if you have difficulty breathing at that point, call a doctor. At that point, phone an ambulance. At that point, go to an emergency department. They're saying, they're positioning it as this potentially fatal killer disease that's wiping people out left, right, and center. But yet they're saying, if you're exhibiting symptoms, don't come for early treatment. Don't come for preventative measures. Wait until you can't breathe and then come and see us. And at that point, obviously, the crack, they would take you into the hospital, slap you in a COVID ward, even if you hadn't got it because of a dodgy PCR or lateral flow test, have you surrounded by other people and probably stick a ventilator tube down your throat, slap some midazolam into you, and the next thing your relatives are being told, sorry, Jonathan didn't make it. He died with COVID, but probably died because he had a garden hose rammed down his throat and the pressure, the oxygen that were blasting into your lungs like a balloon. That's what killed you. It's insane.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, there's a relationship here, and people may not know this, between the early intervention treatments and their suppression and some of the hit pieces that were done on them, places like the Lancet, for example, against hydroxychloroquine, and the experimental vaccines. And what it is, if you think about the emergency use authorization in America, for example, you can't attain that. So what this is essentially, it gives you under emergency powers the ability to fast track and temporarily license the vaccine for human use in a very contracted time frame. What people don't know is the only way that they could do that was if they could not have any early intervention treatment. So somebody could bring something like hydroxychloroquine and demonstrate, actually, this is safe and effective against all the clinical disease endpoints that you want in this pandemic. So infection and severe disease and death. And it is safe and effective in all those areas. Then you couldn't attain that emergency use authorization because it essentially wouldn't be such an acute scenario. You would have a tried and tested product there. And these products like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin are amongst the safest and most well-used, with billions of doses previously used, most well-tolerated and understood right down to dose tolerance that we've ever seen in the world. So to have them on the one hand, you can't have that and then get these emergency use authorizations, and hence the tension between the early intervention treatments and the vaccines.
Yeah, the demonizing. It's not even the fact that there was a takedown campaign against them, but you have somebody like Joe Rogan, love him or hate him. He has the biggest media presence on earth at the moment. My friend Patrick Henningsen was doing a show. I think it was yesterday. I heard some of it, and he did an analysis of the way that radio is actually becoming the more dominant, or podcasting is becoming the more dominant form of media versus, cable TV news, CNN, Fox, etc. And he said the reach that Joe Rogan's experiencing with just 3 podcasts a week, him in the studio, like you and I are talking right now, 3 hours at a time, he's reaching more people than the next 10 media outlets combined. So when someone like Rogan, who took coronavirus, obviously can afford the best care, monoclonal antibodies, getting ivermectin when it's not otherwise available. He documented his sickness. Okay, he was under the weather, pretty bad for a few days, but he came around, and then he was telling people, okay, I took ivermectin, I took monoclonal antibodies. And of course, that was something they didn't want anyone to hear, because he was reaching 11 million people a week. And he had people like Peter McCullough on and Robert Malone on, who were also extolling the virtues of these drugs. So what do they market it as then? They said, okay, this is potential misinformation. These are horse dewormers. And, you actually had people sneering and jeering on CNN saying Joe Rogan's advocating horse dewormers to people. This guy's crazy. He's not crazy. He was prescribed them by a medical doctor. And, he didn't go and buy them off some guy at the street corner. Okay. He didn't get the monoclonal antibodies off some guy in Walmart. He knew what he was doing, and you can bet your life he has access to the best medical care possible. They didn't recommend he sat at home until he couldn't breathe, and then they ventilated him mechanically and maybe injected some midazolam into him. No, they intervened early, and they intervened hard with proven drugs like ivermectin, which has been shown to work, and it's not a horse dewormer. It's primarily used for other purposes. Okay, so that's the kind of battle that we're fighting. Instead of letting us get treated early, they want to treat us as late as possible. But we're coming up to a news break here, and I'm hoping if you're listening, you'll hang around until after the news. I'm joined by my friend Jonathan Weissman. We're going to keep talking about vaccine ingredients. Maybe next we're going to talk about cybersecurity. We're going to talk about a lot of things. So hope you're enjoying the show. Come back after the break. You're listening to Rick Munn on TNT Radio.
This is today's News Talk Radio, TNTRadio.live.
Welcome back to Locked and Loaded with me, your host, Rick Munn. I'm joined this morning by Jonathan Weissman. We're talking a lot of things at the moment. And in case I forget, by the way, Jonathan, I should have said this earlier. Tell us where we can find out more about this from your side of things, in that you've got a website and you also have some presences on social media. So for anyone that's listening that wants to maybe look a little bit further into this and see the research that you've done, how can they connect with you?
Sure. Thanks, Rick. So my website is alltherisks.com. That's alltherisks.com. And on that, you can find links to all my social media. So really across the board, from Twitter, Gab, Getter, and so forth.
So basically that's your hub then to go to other social media platforms. So if you're listening and you're hearing what Jonathan's saying and you're enjoying it as I am, you can find him at all the risks, alltherisks.com. And from there, you can connect with any other social media platforms that he has. So thank you for that information. Let's look at, because there's a lot of things I want to cover with you today, and the time's running away so fast, and I want to try and make sure we touch on everything that I'd like to this morning. Maybe at some point you consider coming back if things change and evolve and things happening over here. I would love to have you back on, Jonathan. Vaccine ingredients. I've noticed you have done a lot of freedom of information requests to various companies and people with regards to getting a handle on what's actually in these vaccine ingredients. So let's talk about that for a little bit. What have these freedom of information requests yielded to you information wise? And have you found it easy to get information, or has there been brick walls, stone walls, and booby traps along the way? What's the story?
Sure. Yeah. Well, this is a hot topic for me. This is certainly one of the most interesting topics that I find that I can do. So here's the situation. Essentially, there's a lot of rumors online in terms of what may or may not be in these experimental vaccines. And so for me, I do watch everything. I look at what all the independent researchers are saying, but I'm very much an open source researcher. So I'm very much interested in getting the medical regulators to disclose information from the drug manufacturers like Pfizer and Moderna. And then we can point to that and say, right, now we know exactly what is in these vaccines and what happened during the clinical trials. So what happened is there was a document put out August last year called Summary Basis for Regulatory Action for Pfizer's product. And this is when you have this name change for marketing called Comirnaty, which is essentially the name of the experimental product. And when these vaccines pass a certain amount of time, they are allowed permission to essentially be marketed slightly more, you could say aggressively, and they're entitled to have a name change. In this document, there are irregularities, and I cover this all on my website at alltherisks.com under trade secret. Because of these irregularities, I started to see there was a problem with the quantity of water for injection inside of the product. So I basically wrote a freedom of information request to the MHRA, the UK medical regulator, and I said, listen, just tell me the exact quantity of the water for injection. And my final question was, go and confirm what the FDA have said. And I pointed to two separate parts of their document because I knew they don't line up. So I thought that would be an interesting question. And they essentially released to me, and I believe this is the only one anywhere in the world, and I've checked in with lots of researchers, they didn't confirm my actual question, but they released the redacted ingredients table for Pfizer, and it's called 3.2P1. And that was very interesting.
Now, when you say it was redacted, they've obviously blacked bits and pieces out. What kind of information did they black out, or what were they? What was when you got that document from the freedom of information request? How much of it was actually redacted, or did they go crazy with the black marker?
They've gone pretty crazy, you could say. So the little excerpt I have includes essentially the raw ingredients table, and this is called table 3.2P11, and it's industry standard. Everyone knows about this from the MHRA in the UK, the EMA in Europe, and the FDA in America. So the only line of the table that they didn't fully redact was the line that I asked for, which was water for injection. But even then, it shows the amount of water for injection as designated by QS, which means it's a Latin term and it means as much as may suffice. So essentially, that doesn't tell us exactly how much water for injection is in it. I was trying to ensure that there isn't a proprietary solution alongside the water. That was really the angle I was coming from. They've blacked out all of the other publicly disclosed ingredients, like the lipids we spoke about earlier and the drug substance. Now, they claim that they have those quantities in the other documents that they've released, but for this table, they have blacked it out. And when I asked them to unredact it, they said that they wouldn't, because the full quantitative composition is exempt from disclosure under Freedom of Information Act exemptions.
So let me get this right. They were redacting information based on quantitative percentages rather than the fact that it's actually XYZ ingredients. So their spin is they're redacting not the ingredients, but the quantity of said ingredients. Is that correct?
Actually, that's the first part. So the first part is the quantities. The second part, and this is where it's conjecture, we don't know. There's 7 rows at the bottom of the table, which are completely redacted. So we don't know what these are. These are not known ingredients, but it stands to reason, since this is literally the raw ingredients table, if the bottom 7 rows are totally redacted and we only know publicly of the top 11 rows, it stands to reason, since this is an ingredients table, that this must find its way into the final product. And I actually believe these may be manufacturing ingredients. So what this may be is known contaminants or residues that persist into the final product. And a person might say, well, these are trace amounts, it doesn't matter. Well, no, you go back to the history of vaccines and other pharmaceutical products, contamination is a major issue. You go back to the polio vaccines in the 60s, it was this SV40 virus. That was the contamination that caused lots of problems. Or a more recent example, which isn't a vaccine, but it's still interesting, is Johnson & Johnson. It was their inability for decades to purify the core ingredient of their talcum powder or baby powder with residues of asbestos that led to that massive finding in the Supreme Court against Johnson & Johnson. So the manufacturing process is absolutely key. And I believe that this is what it shows. It shows there are known contaminants in the product, but we're not entitled to know what they are.
So when you speak of rows in the table, give us an idea, or give me an idea, give the listeners an idea. If you've got a full table of contents or substances that may be in those products, how many are we looking at? 5, 10? You mentioned 11 and 7. So are there at least 18 different products in that? Can you give us an estimate or what?
Sure. So at the top of the table, we have listed the 11 known publicly disclosed ingredients, which is essentially the drug product itself, the drug substance, which is the mRNA, and then essentially the lipid encapsulation of that, and then water as the solvent that dissolves all the solids in it. Below that in the table, there are 7 rows. Now, it may be based, because you can try to work things out based on how they redact. They redact in these straight horizontal black lines. And I invite anybody to go to my website and offer an explanation. I'm very interested in the open source community. So if anyone's interested, my email address is there. Feel free to drop me some thoughts. I believe the top row may be a table heading, for example, just based on the redaction, which would leave us potentially with 6 redacted ingredients. Now, there's no way to establish exactly what they are because they simply don't tell us. Either these are fully undisclosed ingredients, which would be quite shocking. And that is a possibility, because you look at some of the language that they talk about in the documents the MHRA put out. So, for example, they point me back to what's called the SMPC. So the MHRA, they point back and they said to me in my Freedom of Information request, don't worry about the quantitative composition. It will match the qualitative composition in the SMPC, Summary of Product Characteristics. But that list is also qualified as active excipients, which essentially means it has a known active function. Here. Either I think these are undisclosed ingredients that are considered to be inactive, or these are trace residue amounts that they haven't fully removed from the very complicated manufacturing process. In either example, my point is very simple. If people are going to be coerced, bullied, and threatened to take this thing, and it's going to become a condition of employment and a condition for entering public places, we're all giving up a lot these last 2 years. I think the drug manufacturers should give up some of their...
You see, the thing about it is, in case maybe there may be somebody listening going, well, it's a drug company. They can't give away their secrets. It's like Kentucky Fried Chicken, right? The Colonel's secret recipe for whatever it is they douse those chicken pieces with before they deep fry them and we eat them out of a bucket. It's the secret recipe. So if I went to KFC and I said, I want to know what's in the mix that you put on your chicken, they could say, listen, I can't tell you that because obviously we're a commercial business. And if you really need to, we could maybe show you the ingredients, but not the percentages. We'll have to redact some of that. I get that. And obviously, as a drug company, Pfizer could be saying, well, I don't want to give Johnny my ingredients because he could have a laboratory outside his house and he could be going and he might manufacture a vaccine. He might turn into a competitor, which of course you won't. But, they'll rationalize it that way. It is important because let me say this for anyone that's listening. If you go to the supermarket, and you buy any ingredient, any product, you can lift it up, and on the back or on the packaging, there will be a list of ingredients. Every ingredient must be listed, and the percentages in, I believe it's from greatest composition to least on an ingredients packet has to be there. So if you lift up a packet of cornflakes, you go to the side, it'll say it contains this, down to the last ingredient. If there were black redactions on the list of ingredients, or you went to buy some fish fingers or a ready meal, for one, and you look at it and goes, well, why are the black lines everywhere? What's in this? And you phone up, the manufacturer and you say, hey, I want to know what I'm consuming here. I'm not just taking some product. Why have you got black lines everywhere? You wouldn't buy that product. You wouldn't take that product. But yet people are queuing up literally by the million to inject themselves with something that, even if they said, what's in this? The doctor would say, I couldn't say because they redact the ingredients. There is a little leaflet that you'll get with it, but it's got all these kind of funny jargon terms on it. So, don't ask me questions. Just roll up your sleeve and take your product. There's a disconnect between what people would accept in normal life and what's going on around these injections. I can't understand that at all.
And again, it's like the messaging from the government and from the NHS, where they talk about, we're here to listen to your questions. You'll hear this kind of idea. And it's like, okay, people like me have plenty of questions we'd like to ask. I have, I'd like to see the whole I'm not going to see it, but I want to see the whole manufacturing process unredacted. I want to know exactly how all these ingredients got manufactured. And so I have actually raised another Freedom of Information request just this week. And I've essentially said, look, there's all this debate, as some of your listeners may know, around contamination or deliberate inclusion of graphene or graphene oxide, because there's a whole history in delivering this kind of technology more effectively with graphene oxide. So what I've said to them, because I've seen a few Freedom of Information requests essentially saying, does it contain graphene oxide as an undisclosed ingredient? And the MHRA always turn around and say, no, it doesn't. So I thought, put a different spin on it. Why not ask them to justify whether there's contamination through the manufacturing process of the raw excipients with graphene? Yep. For example, you talk about water for injection. When you go back a few years, the bodies basically, which are called like the European Pharmacopoeia, which basically sets the standards for the manufacture and the quality of different excipients, they changed the rules essentially, and not only in Europe, but in Japan and America, to essentially allow for different ways to manufacture water for injection. And one of the new ways you can do it is through reverse osmosis. And it's known that one of the ways that they purified the water, this is producing highly purified water, which is the subject I was interested in, through a new technique called reverse osmosis, which basically creates a little filter. And what do they use to filter it? Graphene
oxide, no doubt. Yep.
Yeah,
so there has to be positive contamination, even if it's not active and planned for. There has to be some. It's just not physically possible for a piece of material to contact the air and not shed. I mean, like if you go to a river, look at a river. Go to Tullymore Park up in Newcastle. Watch the rocks. Some of those rocks are worn away. Why? Because they've come into contact with water for the last however many thousands of years. When two elements come into contact with each other over time, there has to be some kind of breakdown and cross contamination, whether it be active or whether it be passive. So if that's the case, let's look at graphene oxide, okay? Because that's something that I don't want to miss. A lot of people have heard about it. It's looked upon as like a sinister ingredient by those people that are awake, in inverted commas. Most people don't know about it, don't care about it. Oh, what's graphene oxide? Tell us a little bit about this graphene oxide, or what do you know about it?
Sure. So I'm probably not like a massive expert on it, but what I would say is, in terms of its properties, one of the properties, as I said, for the water is really down to the sort of like the sharpness of it, and it's essentially very, very thin. And essentially, it can have that sort of role with regards to a purification filter, as I mentioned. So it has some quite unique properties. In terms of its actual sort of chemical structure and its properties not so much the structure, but more sort of like its solvency even. So even the amount to which it dissolves in water. I've been reading some papers recently, even on some of these things, it's let's be honest, it's relatively not very well understood, but it has some properties that basically may aid with drug delivery systems, a bit like those novel lipids I mentioned earlier, especially the cationic lipid. And this is the point, and I think this is very important. We have examples now, and when I look at the literature, what I see in the scientific papers is a lot of excitement over, we have a cationic lipid that creates a positive charge in a cell that protects the mRNA. We have graphene oxide that can do wonders for water purification. Yes. I read an article from the World Economic Forum from 2015. It's online. Anyone can view it. And they're extolling the virtues of graphene for water purification, which is my subject of interest, until the MHRA can disprove this to me otherwise. And so all this emphasis on the potential benefits, but isn't it interesting? And don't you see this in so many areas like GMO foods and so many things? Not enough emphasis on, is this scientific innovation good for human health? Same story.
Yeah, see that you've just made the point. Okay, they're extolling the virtues of graphene oxide as a water purification, enabler. Okay, I'm not disputing that. But I can also say to you, Jonathan, by the way, I have a bottle of bleach next door and it's fantastic at killing germs in my toilet bowl. Okay, there's no dispute about that. It's wonderful. But is it something that I want to put inside an ingredient that I'm injecting into my arm? Not necessarily. So that's the problem. You see, we have the marketing slant, and it's always on, okay, it's a fantastic water purifier. So therefore we're putting pure water into your body. Yeah, but contaminated possibly. We don't know by an element that we don't know a whole lot about. One thing I can say is I'm pretty sure of the people that are using graphene oxide have done a lot of research, certainly done a lot more research on it than us. They're not picking some random ingredient that they think, hey, this is giving pure water into people's arms. No, there has to be something more to it than that. I am not well versed on it, but it's something that people need to be aware of. Like, for example, there's so much happening at the minute, and it's so difficult to keep up with everything and be an expert in one area or another. Thankfully, you've went down one particular route, in this case, these vaccine ingredients and what's going on with them, and your background in cybersecurity, you're well positioned to talk about that. The average person, like myself too, because, I'm learning every day, I like to speak with people like yourself that have done specific research in one particular area, that we can talk into that and go into that in a little bit more detail. And maybe the listeners can say, okay, I need to maybe need to look up a little bit about what's going on with these ingredients. Because when this all began last year, I remember it was around about March last year, the first vaccine that was unleashed upon the world was the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. And people just weren't aware that at one point there were 23 countries that had suspended the use of that over clotting concerns. The only country that never did was the United Kingdom, which was obviously the origins, and they were, trumpeting how they had brought this product to market. If you saw Wimbledon last year, it was horrific. They had a standing ovation. There was some woman there who was credited, if you want to use that expression, credited with developing this vaccine and bringing it to market. She was giving a standing ovation. That product has pretty much disappeared now. It's not even on the list. No one, you couldn't give that stuff away even to the most hardened vaccine fanatic because of its track record. It's horrific, but people need to know what's in that. And I remember I did a post on this, and I'm surprised they didn't get banned for it. But from Oxford AstraZeneca's own website, or from the gov.uk's website of ingredients, they were saying things like there's recombinant chimp DNA in that vaccine. Chimpanzee, that is, for anyone that's not short for something else, a chimpanzee, recombinant chimpanzee DNA in those vaccines, and cells, they don't call it that, cells from an aborted fetal line from, the 1960s, from a little girl that was aborted in the Netherlands. They've cloned cells from her kidneys, and these are in these vaccines. Now, that's bringing back again to the church. People have conscientiously objected to taking vaccines and say, I don't want to put something in my body that contains something that originated in an aborted child. Okay, that's down to the individual. That's your choice whether or not to make that decision or not. But now the church is almost overriding that personal stance to say, no, actually, you need to love your neighbor as yourself. They're pushing that to the side and they're pushing that under the carpet. And that's why it's important, if you're listening and you're considering taking these vaccines, you need to fully understand what you are actually putting into your body. Because when you look at the vial, or you look at that injection, it's just a little needle and it's just a little syringe and it's just got some clear liquid in it. So you think, well, it can't be so bad. Listen, if that was full of arsenic or it was full of some kind of toxic poison, you would want to know what it was going into your body. But people are just happy to go along blindly and not do the research. So I would say, like you've done, people, you need to understand what you're dealing with here. You need to understand what they're actually injecting into your body, and you need to understand what the long-term effects of these substances could be. I think people are just they're wallowing in ignorance.
Sure, and absolutely. I just say, you look at some of the documentation, and again, this is in the open source, like, for example, from the EMA, the European Medicines Agency. They did a public assessment report on Pfizer. If you go through that report, it's dated 19th of February last year. You go through that report, you will see that there are substances used in the manufacture of the Pfizer product of animal origin. You will see that they found that some of the RNA, which is the instruction to create the spike protein, was going to instruct it to create spike proteins of the wrong length. You will see lipid-related impurities. You will see that some of the manufacturing process didn't work completely. You will see they identify prions as being the main theoretical risk identified by the applicant, which is Pfizer. In other words, they're telling the medical regulators what the biggest risks are, not the other way around. So plenty of things there to be concerned about.
Yeah, and that's, knowledge really is power. And even despite that, if you do this research, if you find out what's in there, if after all that you still decide you want to go ahead and do it, then listen, that's your, I would be as bad as the government if I was telling you can't, you must not, it's up to you, but you need to understand what you're dealing with. We're going to go to a break real fast. We'll be back in 2 minutes, and we're gonna wrap this up with some more discussion with Jonathan Weissman. You're listening to Rick Munn on TNT Radio.
You have the right to know about culture, the right to know about the economy, the right to know about technology, and to know about sports. You have the right to know about education and politics and the weather. You have the right to know what's happening abroad and in your backyard. But above all else, you have the right to know that this right is under attack, and we must work to protect it. Because in order to be free, we must be informed. Understand the threats. ProtectPressFreedom.org.
Unlike other health concerns, mental illness is not always easy to see. Depression won't show up on an eye chart, and you won't find PTSD by looking at a thermometer. Sorting out a mental health concern takes professional diagnosis and treatment. Anxiety won't just go away under a bandage. If you or a loved one has a mental health concern, call 1-800-662-HELP for free and confidential information and treatment referral. Learn more at samhsa.gov/support.
A few years ago, Steve Faircow's lungs were failing.
I don't think I had more than a couple weeks to live.
That's when Steve received a lung transplant made possible by an organ donor. Now Steve can do things he never imagined, like climbing 94 floors to the top of a skyscraper.
I never knew that breathing could feel this good. It's an incredible gift.
What could you make possible as an organ, eye, and tissue donor? Leave behind the gift of life. Go to organdonor.gov, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Health Resources and Services Administration.
Can you imagine what it's like to be eaten alive? In summer, dogs who were chained or penned outside know. Their waste attracts biting flies who attack areas in dogs' bodies where their fur is thin, especially their ears. They can't rest for the flies. Prevent fly strike by doing 3 things. Bring dogs inside, pick up solid waste daily, and apply medicated fly repellent ointment to affected areas. Need help? Call PETA at 757-622-PETA.
Today's News Talk Radio, TNTRadio.live.
Welcome back to Locked and Loaded with me, your host, Rick Munn, and my special guest this morning, Jonathan Weissman. We've been covering a lot of ground, and if you've been listening, we've been talking about vaccine ingredients, vaccine deployment, morality, the church, you name it. We've pretty much talked about it. I want to spend a little bit of time highlighting some of the work that Jonathan has also been doing in addition to his research, which you can find at alltherisks.com. Alltherisks.com. It's a website that Jonathan has where you can see the research that he's undertaken, and also links to any other social media accounts that he has. I was looking through that website myself last night, and I came across a link through to an event that you had organized that I want you to tell us a little bit about. It was called the Health and Truth Summit that was held in Northern Ireland in the 27th of November last year, I believe it was. Is that correct?
Correct.
Tell us a little bit about that, Jonathan. What was it, and what prompted you to organize that, and what was the aims and objectives of that session?
Sure. So yes, sort of around about October last year, myself and some Christian friends started to explore the possibility of putting on a little summit here in Northern Ireland, essentially to cover off all the topics that are pertinent to the current times, especially from a Christian perspective, but also more generally. So we ended up putting on an event called, as you say, the full name is actually the Emergency Health and Truth Summit, hence the severity of the times. What we had was essentially, we had a pastor come from Scotland, which is John William Noble from Aberdeen. He gave a message really on the church's response and on morality with regards to, vaccine mandates. I gave a speech going through a risk-benefit analysis you can find at my website. And we had various other speakers, including Dr. Liz Evans from UK Medical Freedom Alliance. Essentially, what we're trying to do is to get the conversation going and to sort of bring it out with more boldness so that everyone might hear all these important messages. So for more on that, please visit my website or visit healthandtruth.org.
Yeah, I noticed one of the guests, or you'd mentioned it was like a little video clip that you had done summarizing the event. You also had Dr. Anne McCluskey, I think it was. Was she a speaker at that as well?
Correct. Yeah, she was.
In case anyone's listening and doesn't know, Dr. McCluskey is a doctor from Derry direction. I think that's correct, isn't it?
That's right.
And she was very outspoken against what was happening. When I say outspoken, she wasn't outspoken at all. She was simply telling the truth and trying to give people information that they could make informed consent. That now makes you outspoken. So I'm classed as an outspoken individual, probably a right-wing fanatic conspiracy theory, probably Nazi supporter, simply because I'm trying to say, listen, you can't necessarily trust what the government is telling you. Do your own research, do your own fact finding. And when you have come to your own conclusion, don't blindly follow a narrative. Don't blindly follow the propaganda. Make an informed decision. And then afterwards, listen, I hope you're well. I hope it works out for you. Don't wish you any ill. That's what I believe from what I've seen Dr. McCluskey was also doing in her practice. She was vilified. She was demonized. What evil did she commit? Did she have a past as a mass murderer that we don't know about, or was she simply telling the truth?
Absolutely. And I've got to know Dr. McCluskey a little bit, and just a formidable person, medical professional, and even just, I would say, really just a human rights advocate at this stage. And I think that's really what someone like Dr. McCluskey is. And it was a real privilege to be at the same event as her and to listen to Dr. McCluskey's speech. I think it must have been so lonely to walk that path at the beginning. For me, it's somewhat easier at this point because more is known at this point about the adverse reactions. Yeah. But essentially, when I think back to those people who are amongst the first to speak up in Northern Ireland and elsewhere, I think we owe them a lot, a big debt of thanks, essentially, because one of the things we want to do, and I'm trying to encourage, when one person speaks out, it makes it easier for the next person. What I'm doing when I stand up, outside City Hall at one of these protests that we have, and it's been a real privilege to do that the last few times. Yeah. And I'm saying, look, I have a job in Belfast. I'm just a regular person, professional. I can do this. And essentially, there's nothing that I'm saying that I'm ashamed of, or I feel anyone can catch me out on, because everything I'm saying is essentially in the literature already. So you have a problem with me. You have a problem with the sources I'm coming from.
Yeah, you're just simply stating facts. And the facts, if people say, oh, where did you get those facts from? Was it some right-wing? No, it's from the actual drug manufacturer themselves, or from the Office of National Statistics, or from the so-called UK Health Security Agency, which is a very disturbing title, UCSA. It's not particularly nice. Dr. McCluskey also, just to give her props, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm just doing this. I wasn't planning to talk about her, but she was somebody that was in the back of my mind because she was associated with that conference that you did. I think she had retired from medical practice. And when she saw the burden that the health service was being placed under when this pandemic, in inverted commas, hit, am I right in saying she came out of retirement and actually re-registered herself as a practicing doctor simply to assist the health service in Northern Ireland? Is that right? And at that point, they jumped on her?
I believe so. That sounds about right. And
I think it is. Yeah,
I think so. And that would be typical of Dr. McCluskey, who, as I said, is very passionate for her patients' health and for the community. And it's the same argument I would make for someone like myself or all these other people speaking out. We're not sort of crazy people that are really selfish and hate, and hate everybody and don't want people to be healthy. No. Quite the contrary. We're amongst, I would argue, the ones who are most informed, who are staying up late at night, studying and thinking about issues and trying our best to bring balance to a debate. We're in a very tight situation here where there's a bunch of mismarketing going on, which I think, is pretty serious and possibly criminal on the part of our government and our health regulators to mismarket a medical product that's experimental. What we're trying to do is just bring balance to the debate. And so, Dr. McCluskey has been doing a great job for a while, and it's really just a privilege to stand alongside people like Dr. McCluskey.
Yeah. You see, the thing is as well, people have got to understand, like you, for example, just to give people an idea what's happening here today, you've taken a day off work. Normally people would be on here for like 50 minutes. When I asked you, look, could you possibly talk for 2 hours because we've got a lot to cover? You got up early this morning, you're sitting here, your throat's getting dry, you're swigging water because you've been talking for 2 hours. There's nothing in this for you per se. Okay, people can say, oh, well, he wants to promote himself. You're not promoting yourself. You're promoting the research that you have done for the benefit of other people, because we're not being provided with that information by anyone else. This is a labor of love. It's not like you're going to ride off into the sunset and, buy a ranch in California and, raise horses off the back of this, and neither am I. You're doing this off your own bat because you're trying to promote the truth and you're trying to give people at least information that they can make a balanced decision on. You're not trying to run people's lives, and you're not trying to get people to rise up and destroy the government. You're just simply saying, listen, I'm an ordinary guy. I'm just doing a little bit of work. I want to put it out in the public domain. And if I was to go onto your website and read it and go at the end of it, that guy's a raving lunatic, I'm not paying any attention, that's fair enough. Okay. And if anyone wants to listen to the show today and say that guy Rick is absolutely off his head, that doesn't matter to me. All I'm doing is presenting what I believe to be the truth based on factual information, as are you. After that, people can take it or leave it, but you've done your job in that you've said, well, at least when all this is said and done, I have tried in my capacity that I have, and given the tools that I have, I've tried to tell people the truth. But what can you do? You can lead a horse to water, but you can't necessarily make it drink.
Absolutely. And essentially, I like to say what I'm doing is called open source intelligence. It's using documents and information that's publicly available. Almost everything I do, really everything, is something where I provide you with the link and with the source, and you can check out my analysis of that source. But essentially what we're trying to do is to give information where it's been suppressed, because the whole paradigm here is wrong. These are experimental products. When you have experimental products, it's essentially an experiment. You should have to go out of your way to sign up for it, and you should be given time free from pressure and coercion to weigh up not only all the short-term safety risks. We talk about myocarditis, inflammation of the heart muscle. We talk about anaphylactics, an acute severe adverse reaction, maybe to the PEG. Yeah. Those are just the short-term, and I'm not downplaying them, but those are the short-term acute reactions most people are familiar of, maybe most people are afraid of. However, it's very important that people understand there's a lot more that we already know in terms of the long-term prognosis that could be something for people to think about. And for me, one of the things that's so unacceptable, our leaders barely give us any of the short-term reactions that they even accept. They try and sow doubt into the public adverse reaction systems like the yellow card scheme. But not only that, they essentially do not convey any of the long-term risks, none of them whatsoever.
Yeah, that's back to that thing about, freedom of information and information becoming freely available, as well as freedom of information. When you get freedom of information, it also has to be freely available. You shouldn't have to go through smoke and mirrors to get it. And just as an example, it wasn't necessarily to do with vaccines directly, but I saw an exchange this week in Stormont, which is Northern Ireland's parliament, for want of a better expression, where the health minister, for want of a better expression, Robin Swan, was answering a question from one of his colleagues. And basically the allegation was, listen, you introduced vaccine passport measures in Northern Ireland and no information was made available to the MPs to talk about this. And his reply was, and this is what he said, I told my honourable friends that the information, I have it. If you want it, come and see me. Okay, come and see me and I'll show it to you. He said 2 people came to me, to which the reply was, we shouldn't have to be chasing you to get information on which you've made a decision that has been catastrophic for the country in hindsight. That decision to introduce vaccine passports, they're now removing them again next Wednesday at midday. Why Wednesday at midday? They just want to stretch it out that little bit longer. But the fact of the matter is, our health minister had documentation, which, let's face it, was full of holes anyway. And he said, okay, if you want to see it, you come and see me. Instead of saying, okay, I've based this decision on the following and I'm presenting it to the parliament. No, it doesn't work that way. Everything is held back and everything is put, it's a cloak around it, smoke screens. It's highly suspect behavior by our governments. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And again, that comes down to the imperative. People might say, well, why is somebody like a cybersecurity professional getting involved in this? Why are you touching public health? That's a dangerous thing to do. And I'd say to that, well, actually, what if the people who are supposed to be acting with independence, they shouldn't be parroting the line of World Economic Forum or World Health Organization, or most egregiously, the pharmaceutical manufacturers themselves making billions of dollars or billions of pounds each year. They should be independently protecting their population and asking all the right questions. And at the very, very least, when they find this information out, it should be easily available to the public. And there's an idea with informed consent. It's not just you have description of, let's say, something like myocarditis, pericarditis, so inflammation of the heart or the fluid-filled sac, the pericardium around it. You have to express this in language that a layperson can understand. You and I might have the time and the volition to go and study and work out what all this stuff means. But you've also got to make that available for that person who doesn't have the time or educational background to understand those issues. You've got to say that causes, heart issues or heart damage, very simply. And they're not doing that either.
See, the thing is, too, that the accusation that could be leveled against us today, you and I, okay, someone could be listening and they don't like what we're saying and they think we're potentially harming people by spewing out information because we're not doctors. Okay, you're not a doctor, Jonathan. What are you talking about? Rick, you're not a doctor. You don't know what you're talking about. The people that are giving this information from the public forums, for example, Robin Swan in Northern Ireland, he's no doctor. As far as I know, he's a farmer. Okay. And I'm not disrespecting farmers, but farmers deal with cows, sheep, pigs, and growing crops, pulling potatoes out of the ground. They don't deal with making business decisions based on vaccination status or lack of vaccination status or licensed premises. I could arguably turn around and say to Robin Swan, you're not a doctor. What are you doing? To which he will reply, oh, but I take advice from the chief medical. I take advice from doctors. Well, so do we. The stuff that you're talking about the pericardium and myocarditis, that's anatomy. You didn't discover those things. Somebody else did, but you're going on someone else's research who is credible and accredited. So when you talk about, using nasal or nasal hygiene and adding things up your nose. It's not some kind of lunatic idea you've came up with. You're going from research and advice from like a Dr. Peter McCullough, who's one of the most highly qualified cardiologists and most published peer-reviewed authors of papers on COVID and COVID response and vaccines in the world, without a shadow of a doubt. Or Dr. Robert Malone, who's accredited with inventing, or at least having a hand in inventing these mRNA vaccines. Those people know what they're talking about. So you're simply repeating factual information from the world experts. You're simply doing that. You're not introducing any new concepts here today, and neither am I, in the same way that Sajid Javid, for example, he's a health minister, in inverted commas. What's his background? Is he a surgeon, or what is he? No, he's a banker, for want of a better expression. Also, he really is a banker, and he's now working in the health service. Robin Swan's a farmer. These people that are running Stormont, I don't want to go into who they are, but look at their backgrounds, people, and ask yourself, are these the kind of people you want to be taking medical advice from? And good luck with that one.
And one of the points I've tried to make here is, let's look at the example of your local GP, your doctor. And again, this is not to be disrespectful to the doctor, but let's try and understand what's going on here. So we have a person who's probably really busy, has many patients, for whatever reason, whether COVID or adverse reactions or all the problems the health service faces. They've probably had a very busy couple of years, and they've been told, this is the best thing to give your patients, right? And they're dealing with lots of stuff all the time. They're also financially incentivized, as we mentioned earlier. Now, I've heard it said that in medical school, they tend to only do a relatively short amount, maybe even just a day, on immunology. They're not really immunological experts. This is a fairly niche theory, the theory of vaccines, the theory of how you can boost it or train it through vaccination. So I would say, if you've got professionals who are really busy, we can't really say that they're totally independent like myself, and we have novel technology with all this pressure and stress that the government's created for us. Surely then it should be seen as a good thing that somebody like myself or whoever who's a researcher who's willing to do it for free. In fact, I actually give out a lot of stuff. Like everything I've done, I've just given out to people just so I can blunt the accusation that I've got some vested interest in it. Surely, though, bringing this to people's attention is a service to society, not the other way around.
Correct. And you see, if you're wrong, okay, let's say you're wrong about everything, or they're wrong about everything, the lack of public debate is something that should ring alarm bells. So someone could listen and say, okay, Jonathan's talking about this and he doesn't know what he's talking about. But if you were to sit down with an actual doctor today and present these same facts to said doctor, and ask them to be truthful and open and honest, there's very little of what you're saying, if anything, that they could actually refute. And in fact, if you started to question them, which I have done, I've bumped into a few people that I used to go to school with who are now clinicians. One's a pediatrician, they're actually, they're working in hospitals and clinical settings as doctors. When I questioned them, this is going back 6 months ago, when I questioned them about what was going on and what these vaccines were, and I put my theories forward to them, they couldn't refute a single thing that I said. They just looked at me blankly and said, okay, well, listen, it was nice to speak with you, and off they went. There has been no, and I mean zero, public debates between any kind of medical professionals. There's a guy called Dr. Vernon Coleman, who right from the beginning of this has called everything out. And Vernon Coleman has a history in medicine going back decades. And he said, I will debate anyone publicly about this business. And if I am wrong, then whoever I'm debating will have the opportunity to shoot me down and paint me out to be some kind of old crank with ulterior motives and that I'm wrong about my medical beliefs and practices. He had no takers. And it's the same right across the board. Any doctors that have been speaking out have been lost their jobs, or they've been kicked off social media, or they've been deemed to be a risk to public health rather than an alternative source of information. And that's a very, very dangerous position that we're finding ourselves in right now.
Well, absolutely. Because what occurred to me, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, in terms of the whole paradigm, is essentially third-party risk management. It's essentially you as an individual are being asked, or more rather, you're being coerced to make an overall risk-benefit decision, which is, do you want to take this thing, or should you take it? It's not even that you necessarily want to. It's more like you might feel you have to in order to participate in society, which is absolutely immoral. So if you think about the name of my website, it's called alltherisks.com for a reason, because actually nobody really should have a problem with somebody just detailing and listing all the risks. Now, you may have an opinion of COVID and the early intervention of COVID. You may think that actually you're sort of fatalist and you think there's nothing that can be done. So you therefore see the efficacy of the vaccine as being so high because you look at the numbers from the government and you think, well, that is absolutely the only way I can get some efficacy. And you're willing to disregard all the risk. Well, I have respect for you. That is your decision. We all make independent decisions based on a risk benefit. But what we mustn't have is the current situation where we are not disclosing the risks to the people, even though these are thoroughly expounded upon already, right down to the molecular level. We know exactly the harm that's being caused and why it's happening.
This business of risk, okay, and I mean, like, ironically, my Twitter handle is no risk, no reward. I am a risk taker, okay, but I balance risk and I act accordingly, and I decide to apply my risk profile to certain environments and people that I associate with. You know, you take a chance sometimes. And I for a long time was a financial advisor, initially through an insurance company. Then I moved on to a big multinational bank, and then I went out self-employed, dealing with high net worth individuals, pension transfers, all that sort of business. So when I was talking to people, say you were a client of mine, I would have to try and ascertain your risk profile to investment. Okay. And usually you were graded between 1 and 5, with 1 being super cautious and 5 being really adventurous. You know, you're really prepared to take a chance with your investments and your future, you know, in return for potentially a greater return, because that's the way it worked. So I would have to talk to you and say, okay, Jonathan, how do you feel about losing all your money? No, that's not an option. Well, then you're not a number 5 then. Okay. How do you feel about losing, 30% of it? No. Do you want to? No, I just want to get my money back at the end of 10 years with a little bit of interest. Then you're a cautious investor. Someone says, listen, Rick, I'm prepared to lose the lot and triple my money over the next 5 years. Then you would be deemed an adventurous investor. So on this risk scale that people have, some people are prepared to take a chance. Say, well, I'm prepared to take a chance that I'll get myocarditis because I think it balances against my chances of dying with COVID. That's an individual choice. I've looked at it and said the risk for me dying is 0.1%. Okay. And now that I've actually had COVID, at least I was diagnosed with COVID. Of course, PCR tests are faulty, lateral flow tests are faulty, but I definitely had something up with me, and it wasn't just the cold and it wasn't just the flu. It's been weird. Okay. There's other ideas I have around about that. But what I'm saying is I believe I should now have antibodies against this, at least whatever strain it was, if it was any strain at all. Okay. So my risk profile towards that injection is it's a no-no. It's an absolute no-no for me because of my age, no comorbidities. I've had it, I've survived, etc. And the risk thing is not something either that's being discussed by the GPs. And you mentioned the GPs, and, very much, if you can't get in, say you had chronic pains in your chest and you phoned your GP today, you'll be put in a queue. They said the doctor will phone you back in, 10 hours. If you call the surgeon and say, can you book me in for a vaccine? They'll have you down probably the same day. Okay. So a little tip for anyone out there who's feeling particularly unwell, tell the surgery you want to be vaccinated. And when you get there and you see the GP, tell them you've changed your mind and you have chronic pains in your chest, or you've got your leg hanging off for one thing and another. That seems to be the only way to get access to these people right now.
Well, absolutely. And it's that sort of fervor for, we can now call it universal vaccination, which is essentially jabbing absolutely everyone, regardless of age, comorbidities, and health status. But again, it really underscores the fact that and this is the whole foundation of medicine and informed consent. It's a personal decision. It's called bodily autonomy. We decide individually ourselves which is the best decision to make with regards to any medical treatment. And I think there's something quite dehumanizing about telling a person, even if they've just had a COVID infection, even if they've had an antibody test and they've got antibodies to not only the spike protein, which you get from the vaccine, but also the other proteins like nucleocapsid, for example, which is very, very important part of the immune response. So I think this really is something more than just about public health, given the fact that it doesn't stop infection transmission, as we looked at. This seems to be about compliance and about getting everybody on the same page. even though it's not effective for its stated goal.
Yeah, the compliance thing, this is maybe something that we could cover at another point, because I was wanting to talk to you more about also, there's a lot of things. I've made a big list here of stuff, and I've been going through it, but we've just been scratching the surface. And it's good because I'm talking to someone that I'm living in the same country as, because you understand the mechanics of what's actually going on the ground at the minute. This business of compliance and what's going on with our government is disturbing at the moment. I believe it's maybe something that we'll be able to talk about. Maybe if you come back again sometime, if you have another day off and you're prepared to give up even an hour, we can talk about the mechanics of what's going on in Northern Ireland. But there's a lot of U-turns being done and people are celebrating, which I'm not against. Let's face it, the restrictions that have been in place over here have been lunatic, but we've only had them for like 4 weeks, 5 weeks, and now they're being, our executive or our government spent over £10 million implementing a vaccine passport system at the end of November, going into December, coming into the Christmas period, which effectively destroyed our hospitality industry and bars and restaurants and licensed premises. If you only wanted to drink coffee and eat a sandwich, that's no problem. There was no coronavirus in any cafes or restaurants. Coronavirus in Northern Ireland targets establishments that sell beer or spirits or alcohol. So those places were deemed to be high risk, and those places were hammered over Christmas. End result, backlash, weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now they've done another U-turn and said, okay, from next Wednesday at 12 p.m., because Tuesday at 12 p.m. or Monday at 12 p.m., the threat is still there. The threat is leaving Northern Ireland at midday, specifically midday on Wednesday. So from midday on Wednesday, again, we can live a semi-normal life over here. Listen, I'm going to rant, but we're coming up to the news here. Jonathan, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. alltherisks.com, Jonathan Weissman. I hope to have you on again. God bless you, and I hope you've enjoyed the show. And anyone listening in, please stay tuned. We'll be back after the news. You're listening to Rick Munn.